He looked her up and down right there on the platform, in front of every soul in Timberline, and said it loud enough that even the station master heard it clear through the ticket window. "I can't marry that." 3 words. That was all Colt Mercer needed to undo 8 months of letters, of promises written in careful ink, of a woman who had sold her sewing machine and packed everything she owned into a single trunk to cross half a continent for a man she believed was worth trusting. Rebecca Harlow stood on that platform with the dust still on her traveling coat and the hope still warm in her chest, and she watched it die in the open air of a town she had never seen before this morning. He turned his back on her and walked away. Didn't explain, didn't lower his voice, just turned and walked, like she was something he'd ordered by mistake and was already forgetting. If that had been you standing there, every eye in the crowd on your face, your trunk at your feet, a return ticket in your coat pocket that suddenly felt like the only honest thing in your life, what would you have done? Stay with this story, because Rebecca Harlow did not get back on that train. And what she did instead is going to change everything you think you know about what a woman is capable of building from the wreckage of a broken promise. If this kind of story moves you, the kind with real grit and real heart, subscribe to this channel right now, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, to the morning it all started, and find out who Rebecca Harlow really was before Colt Mercer tried to erase her. The letters had started in February, when the ground was still iron hard and the wind off the northern plains cut through wool like it was paper. Rebecca had found the advertisement folded inside a woman's magazine that her neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, had left on the front porch with a pot of soup the week after Rebecca's mother passed. She hadn't been looking for anything in particular. She'd been sitting at her work table by the window, not sewing, just sitting, which was something she almost never did, because idle hands made the grief louder. The magazine was 2 months old. The advertisement was halfway down a column beside a recipe for molasses cake, and it read simply, "Successful cattle rancher, Timberline territory, seeks capable woman of good character. Letters welcome. Inquire to C. Mercer, general delivery." She almost turned the page. She was 31 years old. She stood 5 feet 11 inches in her stocking feet, which was 4 inches taller than most men in Harrisburg, and a fact that had followed her around like a reputation she'd never asked for. She had copper brown hair she wore pinned back practical, not pretty, because pretty took time she usually spent working. She had her mother's hands, wide-palmed, strong-fingered, built for the kind of work that leaves calluses, and she had her father's stubbornness, which had carried her through 12 years of running his tailor shop after he lost 2 fingers to a press and couldn't manage the fine stitching anymore. She was not a woman who spent much time feeling sorry for herself. She was a woman who got up in the morning and did what needed doing. But her father was gone now too, 3 years back, and her mother 6 weeks ago. And the shop belonged to a creditor whose name she'd rather not say out loud, even in her own memory. And she was sitting at a work table in a rented room with cold soup on the step and a 2-month-old magazine and the very specific silence of a person who has run out of things to hold on to. She wrote back to C. Mercer that same evening. She didn't try to make herself sound like something she wasn't. That was maybe the thing that surprised her most afterward, that she'd been so plain-spoken from the very first line. "I am not a small woman," she wrote. "I am tall, and I am plain, and I work with my hands, and I am not ashamed of any of it. I can sew anything from a shirt collar to a saddle girth. I am not looking for romance. I am looking for a fair arrangement with a man of honest character, and I am willing to do my part." She'd half expected no reply. Colt Mercer wrote back in 10 days. His letter was longer than she'd expected and better written than she'd prepared herself for. He told her about the ranch. 700 acres running along the river bend, 300 head of cattle, a good crew of hands he'd built up over 8 years. He told her he'd had one bad marriage that ended when his wife decided frontier life wasn't what she'd imagined, and that he wasn't looking to make that mistake twice. He said he valued practical women. He said tall was fine by him. He signed it Colt Mercer, and underneath, in smaller letters that looked like they cost him something to write, "I'm not much for poetry, but I'll be straight with you if you'll be straight with me." That line, that was the one that got her. 8 months of letters, 1 a week, sometimes 2. She learned that he rose before light, that he had a scar above his left eyebrow from a fence post incident. He described with dry humor that he'd never been east of the Missouri River, that he kept a dog named Patterson, who slept on the porch and had opinions about strangers. He learned that she could break down and reassemble a treadle sewing machine in under 20 minutes, that she had once altered a dress for a judge's wife so perfectly the woman cried that she was allergic to self-pity and suspicious of men who smiled too easily. By October she had said yes. By November she had packed. By the second week of December she was on a westbound train with her trunk, her sewing kit, her mother's thimble in her coat pocket, and what she would later describe, in the private honesty of her own memory, as an embarrassing amount of hope. The train pulled into Timberline just after noon on a Thursday, the sky the color of old pewter, and the platform crowded with men in heavy coats and a scattering of women in wool scarves. It was cold, the kind of cold that gets into the joints and stays. Rebecca stepped down onto the platform and felt the wind hit her face and thought, all right, this is it. This is the new place. She spotted him before he spotted her. Colt Mercer was not hard to find. He was the tallest man on the platform, or had been, before she stepped off the train, and he carried himself the way men do who are used to being looked at, with a particular stillness that said he knew exactly where he was in a room at all times. He was good-looking in the way that certain frontier men get good-looking, all weather-burned skin and jaw and eyes that had been squinting into distance for so long they'd settled into a permanent kind of seriousness. He was wearing a dark coat and a good hat, and he was holding it by the brim, turning it in his hands, which was the only sign she could see that he was nervous. He saw her. She watched it happen. Watched his eyes travel from her face down to her boots and back up again. Watched the stillness in him shift into something else, something quick and unguarded. The kind of reaction a person has before they remember to control it. She smiled at him. She was nervous too. And when Rebecca Harlow was nervous, she smiled. It was just what she did. And the smile wasn't small or apologetic. It was the full, honest kind that used her whole face. He didn't smile back. She crossed the platform toward him, hand extended. Mr. Mercer, I'm Rebecca Harlow. I expect you've been waiting. He shook her hand. His grip was automatic, the grip of a man who shakes hands without thinking about it. But he was looking at her the way a man looks at something that doesn't add up, some figure on a ledger that doesn't match the column total. You're taller than I expected, he said. I told you I was tall, she said, keeping her voice easy. I know what you said. He let go of her hand. There were maybe 20 people on that platform. She was aware of them the way you're aware of weather, not looking directly, but feeling the pressure of it on all sides. The station master behind his window, 2 women by the far railing, a group of ranch hands watching with the mild interest of men who didn't have anything else to do that moment. Colt looked at the platform boards. He looked at the sky. He looked at some point just past her left shoulder. And then he said, loudly, too loudly, the voice of a man talking himself into a decision he'd already made. I can't marry that woman. The word that was the one that did the damage. Not her. Not Rebecca. That. She felt it land. She felt it the way you feel a step that isn't there. The sudden drop, the body's reflexive lurch to catch itself. Her smile was still on her face because it took a moment for the rest of her to catch up to what had just happened. I beg your pardon, she said. I thought... He finally looked at her, and what she saw in his face was worse than cruelty. It was discomfort, the look of a man who had been caught out and was irritated about it, rather than ashamed. I thought you'd be normal-sized. A rancher's wife has got to be able to... Mr. Mercer. Her voice was quieter than his. That was intentional. You wrote me for 8 months. I know I did. You told me tall was fine. I thought I meant it. She looked at him for a long moment. She was aware that the 2 women by the railing had moved closer, not obviously, but they had moved. She was aware that one of the ranch hands had stopped pretending to look elsewhere. You have a return ticket for me, she said. He reached into his coat and produced it without hesitation. That was the part that told her everything, that he'd already bought it, that he'd already decided, that somewhere between her last letter and this platform, he had made up his mind and all of this had been a formality. He held out the ticket and she took it from him, and she looked at it, and then she looked at him. I'll think about it, she said. She turned and walked back to where the porter had set her trunk, and she sat on it, which was not a dignified thing to do, but it was solid and real, and at that particular moment, solid and real was what she needed. She put the ticket in her coat pocket next to her mother's thimble. She stared at the far mountains, the peaks white with early snow, enormous and indifferent. Behind her, she could hear the crowd on the platform beginning to move again, breaking apart the way crowds do after a spectacle, and she heard someone, a woman's voice, low and cutting, say something she couldn't make out but whose tone was unmistakable. She was not going to cry. She had not cried when the creditor took the shop. She had not cried at her mother's grave, not there, not in front of anyone. She was not going to cry here, on a train platform in a town she didn't know, in front of people she'd never see again. That last thought stopped her. People she'd never see again, only if she left. She sat on her trunk, and she thought about that. She was still sitting on her trunk 20 minutes later when the man appeared beside her. Not Colt. She knew without looking that Colt had gone. She'd heard his boots on the platform boards heading away. That particular gait she'd somehow already learned from 20 feet of acquaintance. This was different boots, quieter. A man who moved like he was paying attention to where he put his feet. "That trunk looks uncomfortable," he said. She looked up. He was somewhere in his late 30s, lean in the way of men who work in weather, with dark eyes, and a face that had been outdoor serious for so long it had forgotten how to arrange itself for conversation. He had his hat in his hand. That struck her. He'd taken his hat off to speak to her, which almost nobody on that platform had thought to do. "It's not comfortable," she said. "But it's mine, so?" He nodded like that made complete sense. "Wyatt Calloway," he said, and offered his hand. She shook it. "Rebecca Harlow. I know who you are." "Because you were watching," she said. "Because everyone was watching," he said, without apology. That's the honest answer. She appreciated the honest answer more than she would have appreciated a polite one. She looked back at the mountains. He didn't fill the silence the way nervous men do. He just stood there with his hat in his hand and waited, and that was a rare enough quality that she noticed it. "I don't know this town," she said finally. "No. Do you have a boarding house?" "Mrs. Aldrich on Depot Street. She's fair." "Is the work here?" She stopped, started again. "Is there work here for a woman who sews?" "Actual frontier work, not parlor work." He thought about it. Actually thought, not just answered. "Ranch gear needs constant mending. Saddles, bridles, winter coats. The dry goods man does some of it, but he's not much good. There's a waiting list at Mrs. Vance's shop in town, but she's got more orders than she can fill." He looked at her directly. "You any good?" "I'm very good," Rebecca said. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly. More like an acknowledgement. "Then yeah," he said. "There's work." She stood up from her trunk. She was taller than him by nearly 2 inches, and he didn't blink, didn't adjust, just looked at her the way a man looks at someone he's talking to. "Can you point me to Mrs. Aldrich?" she said. He picked up her trunk. Not asking, just doing it. "I'll walk you," he said. She thought about telling him she could manage. She thought about the return ticket in her pocket. She thought about Colt Mercer's face and that word, that, and the way everyone on the platform had watched and said nothing. She fell into step beside Wyatt Calloway, and they walked off the platform together, and the town of Timberline opened up ahead of them, raw and wide and cold, and she thought, all right, this is still it. This is still the new place. Mrs. Aldrich was a compact woman of 60-something who looked at Rebecca's height with the expression of a person making a mental note, practically, not unkindly, and showed her to a room at the end of the second-floor hallway that had a ceiling high enough. The room smelled of cedar and old wood and a previous occupant's lavender soap, and it had a window that looked out over the back lot and then the open country beyond, and it was the most privacy Rebecca had had in 4 months of traveling. She set her trunk at the foot of the iron bed, and she sat on the bed's edge, and she took the return ticket out of her pocket and laid it on her knee and looked at it for a long time. She thought about Harrisburg. She thought about the rented room she'd given up, the landlady who'd wished her well with the cautious warmth of someone who doesn't expect good news to hold. She thought about her mother's house, sold to pay the last of the debts, and the shop, and the life she'd reduced to 1 trunk. She thought about 8 months of letters from a man who had written, "Tall is fine by me," and meant it, until he didn't. She folded the ticket in half. She folded it again. She put it back in her pocket. She opened her trunk and she began unpacking her sewing kit. It was late afternoon by the time she finished settling in, and the light through the window had gone that particular flat gray of early winter in high country. She went downstairs and found Mrs. Aldrich in the kitchen. "I'll need to ask you something," Rebecca said. "Sit down then." Mrs. Aldrich gestured at the kitchen table without looking up from what she was doing at the stove. Rebecca sat. "I need to know what it's going to cost me to stay, weekly. And I need to know if there's somewhere I could set up a small workspace, a corner somewhere where I can take in sewing." Mrs. Aldrich turned from the stove. She looked at Rebecca with the assessing look of a woman who had been running a boarding house for a long time and had gotten very good at reading people quickly. "You're not leaving," she said. "Not planning to." The older woman set down her spoon. She named a weekly rate that was fair, a touch lower than Rebecca had expected. "There's a back room off the parlor that nobody uses. It gets the morning light. You could have it for your working if you take care of it." "That's generous," Rebecca said. "It's not generous," Mrs. Aldrich said. "It's practical. Town needs a good seamstress. Mrs. Vance has got a 2-month wait, and she doesn't do leather work." "You do leather work?" "Yes." "Then you'll be fine." She turned back to the stove. Then, without turning around, "What Colt Mercer did today was a shameful thing." Rebecca was quiet a moment. "Yes," she said. "It was." "He's been lord of this town a while," Mrs. Aldrich said. "People forget that isn't a permanent condition." Rebecca didn't answer, but she turned that sentence over in her mind like a coin, looking at both sides. She slept badly. That was the truth of it. The bed was fine and the room was quiet, but her mind wouldn't settle. It kept returning to the platform, to the way Colt had looked at her, to the exact timbre of his voice when he said, "I can't marry that woman," and each time the memory arrived, it deposited the same precise weight in her chest. Not grief exactly. Not even humiliation, entirely. Something more complicated than both. The specific sorrow of a person who had been told by a stranger that they are wrong in their very proportions. She had been told that before, in smaller ways. The tailor's daughter who was too tall for the dance. The girl in school who stood in the back row and felt, always, like she was taking up too much. You do not arrive at 31 without having made some kind of peace with what you are. But peace is not armor. She lay in the dark and felt it all exactly as clearly as she had on the platform. And she didn't fight the feeling, because she had learned that fighting feelings tends to make them louder. She thought about Wyatt Calloway picking up her trunk without asking. She thought about Mrs. Aldrich. People forget that isn't a permanent condition. Sometime before dawn, she slept. In the morning, she went to the dry goods store. The man behind the counter was named Holt, red-faced and amiable, with a voice that ran a little loud, the way voices do on men who have spent too much time in open spaces. She asked about thread, about leather waxing supplies, about where she might source heavier canvas. Holt looked at her over his counter with open curiosity. "You're the woman from the train yesterday," he said. She didn't let it land on her face. "I'm looking for supplies," she said. He named what he had. She priced it out in her head and made a small initial purchase. She had limited funds and needed to be careful. And as he was wrapping her items in brown paper, he leaned on the counter and said, in a confidential tone that was louder than he thought, "I figured you'd be on the morning train." "Then you figured wrong," Rebecca said. He had the grace to look a little embarrassed. He slid her wrapped supplies across the counter. "Well," he said, "you need something. You come back." "I will," she said. She went next to the post office, where she left a notice, handwritten, precise, offering her services for mending, alterations, and leather repair work, reasonable rates. Inquire at Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house. The postmaster, a thin young man with ink on his fingers, read it carefully and put it on the board with the look of a person performing a minor civic duty. She was back at the boarding house by 9 o'clock and had her workspace arranged by 10. The first customer came before noon. He was a ranch hand, trail-worn and slightly sheepish, holding a saddle whose stitching had given out along the seat skirt. A long split, the kind that happens when leather gets wet and dries wrong too many times. He'd gotten her notice from the post office board, he said. He'd been meaning to get it fixed for 2 months, but Mrs. Vance didn't do saddlery, and he hadn't gotten around to riding the 30 miles to the next town. Rebecca examined the damage. She quoted him a price. He blinked. "That's less than I expected." "It's a fair price," she said. "Bring it back Thursday." He left looking mildly confused by his good fortune. She was threading a needle when she heard footsteps on the front porch. Heavy, deliberate, the walk of a man who is accustomed to being heard coming. She looked up from her work toward the parlor doorway and felt a cold thing move through her before she even saw his face. Colt Mercer stepped into her line of sight. He wasn't carrying anything. He had both hands in his coat pockets, which gave him a kind of studied casualness that didn't match his eyes. His eyes were doing the thing eyes do when a person is working out how to say something they haven't quite figured out yet. "I heard you stayed," he said. "You heard correctly," Rebecca said. He looked around the workspace, the saddle, the tools laid out on her cloth, the light coming through the back window. Something moved across his face, quick and unclear. "I came to apologize," he said. She kept her hands on the needle and the leather. "All right. What I said on the platform was said on the platform," she said, "in front of everyone. I wasn't—" He stopped. "I was surprised. I told you I was tall. I thought—" He stopped again. He pulled his hat off and turned it in his hands, the same gesture she'd seen yesterday, the nervous tell. "I thought it would be different when I saw it." "When you saw her," Rebecca said. He looked at her. "When you saw her," she said again, quietly. "Not it. I'm a person, Mr. Mercer. Not a thing you ordered and can return." The color came up in his face. She could see him working at something. Whether it was shame or anger or something else, she couldn't fully tell. There was enough of both in his jaw. "I want to make it right," he said. "That's not possible," Rebecca said. "What you said is said. But you didn't come here for my forgiveness. You came here because I didn't leave, and that bothers you." She looked back at her work. "I appreciate the apology. I'm going to keep working now." He stood there a moment. She didn't look up. She heard him put his hat back on. She heard his boots on the floor and the front door, and then he was gone. She held the needle still and breathed, in and out. The leather was solid under her hands and the light was good, and the work was in front of her. She started stitching. 4 days in, the work was already more than she'd expected. Word in a small town travels on its own current, and the current in Timberline had picked up her notice and her reputation and moved them faster than she could have managed herself. The saddle was done by Thursday, and the ranch hand came back on time and paid without complaint and told 2 other men on his crew. By the end of the first week, she had 3 jackets, a pair of chaps needing restitching along both legs, and a woman from the northern end of town who needed a winter coat let out because she was carrying a child and none of her coats fit properly. That last job Rebecca took at half price and didn't mention it. She was careful with her money. She wrote down every penny coming in and every penny going out in a small notebook she kept in the inner pocket of her work apron. She had brought enough to sustain herself 6 weeks, maybe 8 if she was frugal. If the work kept up at the current rate, she would not need to touch her reserves by the 2nd month. Wyatt Calloway came by on Saturday. He didn't come for work. He came the way people come when they have a reason they haven't stated yet, appearing at the front door with his hat in his hand and a directness in his manner that she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him specifically. "How's the room?" he asked. "Fine," she said. "How's the work coming?" "Better than I expected." He nodded. "Good." He turned his hat by the brim once around. "I have some harness work that needs doing. Winter's hard on leather. Thought I'd bring it by next week if that suits." "It suits," she said. He nodded again. He seemed about to leave and then didn't. He looked at the street and then at her. "People are talking about you," he said. "I expect so." "Mostly it's good," he said. "The talking." He met her eyes. "I thought you'd want to know that." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said, and meant it precisely. Not warmly and not coldly, but exactly. He put his hat back on. "See you next week, then." He went down the porch steps and she watched him go, and she felt something that was not quite feeling, more like the recognition of the possibility of a feeling, the way you sense a change in weather before it actually arrives, something in the air that hasn't happened yet but is arranging itself in that direction. She went back inside. The week after, he brought the harness work. And the week after that, he came back for it and stayed an hour after, and they talked about the cattle market and about the winter coming in hard from the north and about a particularly difficult horse he was trying to work with. And she found that he listened when she spoke. Actually listened, not in the way of a man being polite, but in the way of a man filing information away because it mattered to him. She was not thinking about Colt Mercer. She was not thinking about letters or promises or a platform in December. She was thinking about the work in front of her, about the town that was slowly making room for her, about a lean, quiet man with dark eyes who took his hat off when he spoke to her and meant what he said. And somewhere across town, in the big ranch house that sat above the river bend, Colt Mercer was standing at his window watching the lights of Timberline and feeling, in the sour, particular way of men who are used to having everything, that something was getting away from him. He didn't know yet what he intended to do about it, but he was already thinking. The harness work Wyatt brought that second Saturday was worse than he'd let on. Rebecca laid it out on her work table in the back room and went over it the way her father had taught her, methodically, every inch, no skipping, and found 3 separate places where the stitching had given out, not just from wear, but from the kind of sustained neglect that happens when a man is too busy keeping a ranch alive to notice the small things falling apart around him. The brow band was cracked along its inner curve. The throat latch had been repaired before, badly, by someone who'd used the wrong weight of thread and pulled it too tight so that the leather had puckered. She didn't say any of this while she was examining it. She just worked through it quietly, turning the pieces in the morning light, and Wyatt stood in the doorway with his coffee. Mrs. Aldrich had offered, and he'd accepted, and watched her work without filling the silence with unnecessary words, which she had decided was one of the more valuable things about him. "This throat latch was fixed before," she said finally. "Henderson, one of my hands, did his best. He used saddle thread on bridle leather, too heavy, pulled the grain." Wyatt looked into his coffee. "That explains some things." She set the piece down and looked up at him. "I can fix all of it, but the brow band needs to soak first. I'll have the rest back to you by Wednesday. The band'll need until Friday." "That's fine." "It'll cost more than I quoted," she said, "because of the throat latch. I didn't see that until now." "That's fair," he said. She wrote the adjusted number on her order sheet, and he didn't flinch at it, which told her he was a man who understood that honest work costs what it costs, and arguing about it afterward was a different kind of dishonesty. She appreciated that without saying so. He finished his coffee. He didn't leave immediately, and she didn't prompt him to. And somewhere in those 15 minutes of him standing in the doorway while she sorted her thread by weight, they had, without discussing it, arrived at something that felt like regular company, comfortable in the way that surprised her precisely because she hadn't expected it. "I heard Colt came to see you," Wyatt said. She kept her eyes on the thread. "He did. And?" "And I told him what I thought, and he left." Wyatt was quiet a moment. "Watch him," he said. She looked up. His face was the same, quiet, direct, but there was something underneath the words that wasn't casual. "Why?" she said. "Because Colt Mercer doesn't take losing well." He set the empty cup on the edge of her work table. "And right now he thinks he lost something." "He threw me away," Rebecca said. "He didn't lose anything." "I know that," Wyatt said. "He doesn't." He picked up his hat from the hook by the door and put it on and left, and she stood in the morning light and turned that over in her mind for a while before she went back to work. She went back to work. That was the thing about Rebecca. The work was not a distraction from her life. It was the substance of it. She had grown up with that understanding, absorbed it from her father the way children absorb things that are demonstrated rather than explained. Her father had not been an easy man. He had been impatient and exacting and sometimes harsh in the way he corrected her when her stitching was wrong. And she had not always liked him, but she had always respected the fundamental seriousness with which he approached the work. The idea that doing a thing badly was a kind of lie. She had carried that forward even when she had nothing else left to carry. By the end of January, she had more orders than she could fill in a week. She started keeping a wait list. She had never kept a wait list before. The wait list felt like something she had not quite earned yet, and she handled it with a certain careful humility, making sure people understood that their jobs would be done in order and done right, not done fast. Word had gotten around that her stitching held. In frontier country, stitching that held was not a small thing. Saddles failed in the field, and horses spooked and men fell. Bridles gave out at the wrong moment. A coat whose seams split in a February wind was not a minor inconvenience. It was a genuine hazard. People were not paying her for convenience. They were paying her because they trusted the work. That distinction mattered to her. She had raised her prices slightly by the 3rd week. Not enough to price herself out, but enough to reflect the actual value of what she was doing. She had debated it for 2 days in her notebook, writing out the numbers, crossing them out, rewriting. She raised them on a Tuesday morning and nobody complained, which was its own kind of information. Holt at the dry goods store had started ordering heavier waxed thread specially for her, and had told her so in a tone that was less friendly favor and more straightforward business, which she appreciated. She bought her supplies from him regularly, and he knew it, and they had developed the particular mutual respect of two people who understood they were useful to each other. The woman whose coat she'd let out at half price, her name was Clara Devlin, wife of a homesteader who worked a section 5 miles north of town, came back in February with her husband's work coat, both elbows through and the collar detached. She paid the full price this time without Rebecca having to say anything about it. Clara was 26 and quiet in the way of people who have a lot going on behind their eyes that they aren't in the habit of sharing. And she and Rebecca had developed something over the 2 visits that wasn't exactly friendship yet, but was moving in that direction, the kind of slow warmth that builds between women who recognize a practical intelligence in each other. "You've been busy," Clara said, looking at the work table. "Steady," Rebecca said, which was more accurate. "Colt Mercer's been talking," Clara said. Rebecca kept her face easy. "What's he saying?" "That you're taking work that should go to established businesses, that you're undercutting prices." Clara folded her hands in her lap. "He said it at the hardware store, loud enough that 3 people heard him." Rebecca thought about Wyatt's words. Colt Mercer doesn't take losing well. "I charge fair prices," she said. "I know," Clara said. "I'm just telling you what's being said." "Is anyone listening to him?" Clara considered. "Some are. The ones who owe him, but—" She paused. "Most people aren't. Most people just want their gear fixed." Rebecca absorbed that and put it where she could look at it later. She finished the coat by end of day and sent it home with Clara and thought about Colt Mercer standing in a hardware store talking about her. And she felt something she recognized as anger, clean and certain, without the messy edges of hurt. The hurt had been on the platform. This was different. This was the feeling you get when someone who has already done something wrong decides to keep going, and you understand that the thing you are dealing with is not a mistake but a pattern. She wrote in her notebook that evening, "Keep records. Every job, every payment, every conversation that matters." She had been keeping records already. She kept them better after that. February turned to March, and the cold broke in fits and starts the way it does in high country. A warm week followed by a hard freeze, the mud alternating with ice so that the town's main street was a navigational problem half the time. Rebecca had moved her sewing machine from her room to the workspace properly now, and had invested in a second lamp so she could work into the evening hours when the orders backed up. She had also, quietly and without making a point of it, introduced herself to the 2 other businesswomen in Timberline, the milliner, whose name was Agnes Pruitt, and the woman who ran the small laundry on the east end of town, whose name was Pearl Watkins. She had not proposed any alliance or made any speeches. She had simply been a regular presence, stopping in when she had business nearby, passing a few minutes in conversation, being the kind of person who shows up consistently. Agnes was 60 and had been in Timberline 12 years and knew everyone's business without appearing to. Pearl was 43 and had a laugh that arrived suddenly and departed the same way, and a practical intelligence about the economics of the town that Rebecca respected. It was Pearl who told her in mid-March about the land meeting. "Town council," Pearl said, pulling a sheet through the ringer with her characteristic efficiency. "First week of April. Colt Mercer's pushing a grazing expansion. He wants the eastern water rights extended to his cattle operation." "What does that mean for the other ranchers?" Rebecca asked. "It means Wyatt Calloway loses his summer grazing access," Pearl said, "and a handful of smaller operations lose theirs entirely." She glanced up. "Colt's got 2 council members already. He needs 1 more vote." "Who's the third?" "Gil Hardin. He runs the feed store. He's not Colt's man, but he's not his man either. He owes Colt some money from a bad winter 3 years ago." Pearl let the sheet pile into the basket. "It's a quiet kind of debt. The kind that doesn't get said out loud but gets paid in other ways." Rebecca turned this over. "Does Wyatt know?" "Wyatt knows. He's been at it for weeks trying to build his own case." Pearl looked at her directly. "He's a good man and a good rancher, but he doesn't have Colt's money, and he doesn't have Colt's leverage. What he has is being right." She paused. "Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it isn't." Wyatt brought her the repaired harness on Wednesday, and she had the brow band ready by Friday as promised. And when he came to collect it, he paid immediately and without ceremony. And then he stood by the window and looked at the street outside for a moment before saying anything else. "You heard about the council meeting," he said. "Pearl told me." He nodded. He looked tired in a way he usually concealed better, the skin around his eyes tight, the set of his jaw carrying weight. "I've been doing the research. The Eastern Grazing Land, it's not Colt's to expand onto. There's a rotational agreement that's been in place for 11 years. If he pushes this through, it breaks the agreement and it'll exhaust the land in 3, maybe 4 seasons. After that, nobody can run cattle on it. So he gets 4 years of profit and everyone else gets nothing afterward," Rebecca said. "That's about the size of it." "Does the council understand that?" "Dale Fitch and Monroe Carr don't want to understand it," Wyatt said, naming the 2 council members Pearl had mentioned as already in Colt's pocket. "Hardin?" He paused. "Hardin's harder to read." "What does he need?" Wyatt looked at her. "He needs to believe that the right thing and the safe thing are the same thing. Right now, he's not sure." He turned back to the window. "Colt's been at him. I know he has." "Then you need to be at him too," Rebecca said. "I've talked to him twice." "Talk to him again," she said, "and bring documentation. The rotational agreement, is it written down somewhere?" "County Records Office. Flagmore." "Then get a copy," she said. "Something he can hold in his hand." She met his eyes. "A man like Hardin, he's not going to choose right over safe on someone's word. But a piece of paper from a county records office is different. It's not someone's opinion, it just is." Wyatt looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "You're very good at this," he said. "I kept a business solvent for 12 years on a shoestring," she said. "You learn how people make decisions." He picked up the harness and turned it in his hands, checking the brow band repair with a rancher's thoroughness. He ran his thumb along the stitch line, and she watched him feel where it was solid, really solid, not just looking, but actually checking. "That's good work," he said. Not warmly, just factually, with the same directness he brought to everything. "Yes," she said. "It is." Colt Mercer's next move came not at her directly, but sideways, which was how she'd begun to understand he preferred to operate, the angled approach, the pressure applied at a distance. The dry goods order she'd placed with Holt in mid-March didn't arrive. She asked about it the following Tuesday. Holt looked at her from behind his counter with an expression she'd learned to recognize in the faces of people who are about to tell her something uncomfortable and are trying to find a way to do it that doesn't require them to take a position. "Supplier issue," he said. "The supplier I've been using for 6 weeks without problem," she said. "These things happen." She looked at him steadily. "Holt." He rubbed the back of his neck. He looked at the counter. "Mercer's been doing some buying from the same wholesale house," he said, in a lower voice. "He's got volume, He stopped. "I'm not saying anything definitive." "You're saying enough," Rebecca said. She stood at the counter for a moment, keeping her voice and her face exactly where she wanted them. "Order from a different house," she said. "Whatever the freight differential is, I'll cover it. I need the waxed thread and the heavy canvas by end of next week." Holt looked at her, and then he nodded, with the expression of a man who has made a small decision that costs him a little. "I'll send to Hendricks and Farrow. Takes an extra 3 days." "Fine," she said. She walked out of the store and stood on the board sidewalk in the March wind and breathed. The anger was there, but it was controlled, packed tight. She was beginning to understand the shape of what Colt was doing. Not one dramatic act, but a series of small interferences, each deniable on its own, each designed to make her life incrementally harder until she decided the effort wasn't worth it. The problem with that strategy, she thought, was that it assumed she had a lower tolerance for difficulty than she actually did. She walked to the post office and sent a letter to Hendricks and Farrow directly, bypassing the middleman, setting up her own account. She was back at her work table by noon. She told Wyatt that evening, when he stopped by. He'd begun stopping by with an easy regularity that neither of them had formally acknowledged. And he listened without interrupting. "He's trying to squeeze you out," Wyatt said. "I know what he's doing," she said. "Rebecca, I know what he's doing," she said again steadily, "and I'm not leaving, so he can keep trying." Wyatt sat across from her at the work table, in the chair he'd begun to occupy without being invited to, which she had noticed and not minded. He turned his hat in his hands. the same gesture she'd come to associate with him thinking rather than nervousness. "He came to see me," Wyatt said. She looked up. "When?" "Last week." He set the hat on his knee, stopped turning it. "He told me that you were a—" He used the word liability, that you were stirring up trouble, and that if I was smart, I'd put some distance between myself and what he called that situation. The phrase hit her in the same way the word that had hit her on the platform. She kept her face level. "What did you say?" she asked. "I told him I appreciated his concern," Wyatt said, with a dryness that wasn't humor exactly but was adjacent to it, "and that I'd take it under advisement. And he didn't like that," Wyatt said simply. She looked at him. He looked back at her. Outside the window. The last of the evening light was giving up on the day, and somewhere down the street a dog was barking at something it had probably already lost interest in, and she thought about the 8 months of letters she'd written to a different man, and how wrong she'd been about the shape of a person she'd never actually met. "Wyatt," she said. "Yeah." "Thank you," she said. Not for the specific thing, for the accumulation of things. He picked his hat back up. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just—" He seemed to look for the word and not quite find it. "Just keep doing what you're doing." She told him about the council meeting research, about what Pearl had said about Gil Harden. He listened with the particular attention she'd come to expect from him and asked 2 precise questions, and then said he'd ride to Flagmore that weekend for the county records copy. "Don't go alone," she said, before she'd thought about it. He looked at her curious. "Take someone from town," she said. "Make it witnessed. Make sure someone else sees what document you bring back and where you got it." He thought about that. Henderson could use the ride. Good. He left and she sat for a while in the quiet workroom, needle in hand but not sewing, just thinking. She was not a woman given to fear as a general condition. She had found, over the years, that fear was usually less useful than the practical question of what to do next. But she was honest with herself, and being honest with herself meant acknowledging that Colt Mercer was not a small problem and was not going to become one. She thought about her mother, who had been a quieter person than Rebecca, but not a weaker one. A woman who had kept a household and a business and a difficult husband, running without ever making any of it look like effort, because she'd understood that the appearance of effort invited people to suggest you stop. She thought about her father's hands before the accident, moving through fabric like he and the material were in conversation. She picked up her needle and went back to work. The week before the council meeting, Colt made his most direct move. He had found out, and she was never entirely sure how, whether through Holt or through someone at Mrs. Aldrich's, or through the kind of network that a powerful man in a small town builds simply by being present and paying attention, that she had 2 large pending orders from the Rafter Tea Ranch, the biggest cattle operation besides his own. 14 sets of winter gear, saddles for 6 new hands, a pile of chaps and duster repairs. It was the largest single contract she'd taken on, and it would have funded her operation through summer. The foreman from Rafter Tea came to see her on a Tuesday. His name was Briggs. He was apologetic in the studied way of a man who has been told to be apologetic. "I'm real sorry, Miss Harlow," he said. He held his hat in both hands, turning it. Everyone turned their hats. "The owner's reconsidering. He's got some business interests with Mercer, and—" "He doesn't need to explain," Rebecca said. "I'm sorry," Briggs said again. He looked genuinely uncomfortable, which she gave him credit for. "Thank you for coming to tell me in person," she said. "That was decent of you." After he left, she sat very still at her work table for approximately 3 minutes. She was calculating, quickly and without sentiment, what the loss of the Rafter Tea contract meant for the next 3 months. It wasn't catastrophic. She had enough from her existing orders and her reserves to manage. But it was a message, clearly sent and clearly received. "I can reach your income." She picked up her pen and her notebook and she wrote down the contract value, the date, and the name Briggs had not quite said. She wrote it down carefully, as a fact, not as a complaint. Then she went to find Agnes Pruitt at the millinery. Agnes was doing inventory when Rebecca came in, which she waved away without apology. They sat in the back room over tin cups of coffee that Agnes made very strong and served without comment on its strength. "Rafter Tea canceled on me," Rebecca said. Agnes, who already knew, she almost always already knew, said, "I heard," without any inflection that was either sympathetic or matter-of-fact. Just "I heard." "Who else might he go to?" Rebecca asked. Among the people who use my services. Agnes thought about it without rushing. She named 3 other operations that had some form of business relationship with Colt Mercer. She named 2 more that didn't, but whose owners were cautious men who might read the wind and make a conservative choice. That's 5 potential losses, Rebecca said. Yes, Agnes said. What I need to know, Rebecca said, is whether there's a floor, whether there's a set of customers he can't reach. Agnes studied her with the look she had, the one that seemed to be weighing something. The homesteaders, she said finally, the small operations, the hands who pay out of pocket. He doesn't have leverage on most of them because they don't owe him anything. Those are also the people with the least money, Rebecca said. Yes, Agnes said, but there are more of them. She turned her cup in her hands. And they talk. If you serve them well, they talk. Rebecca sat with that. I've been serving them well, she said. I know you have, Agnes said, with the first real warmth she'd shown in the conversation. That's why I think you'll be all right, but… She paused. The council meeting. Whatever happens at the council meeting is going to matter for you as much as for Wyatt. Because if Colt wins the grazing rights, he wins momentum, Agnes said. And a man with momentum in a town this size is a man who starts to feel like the weather, like something you can't argue with. Rebecca thought about that on the walk back. She thought about weather and momentum and the specific physics of small towns where a few people set the temperature for everyone. She had never liked the cold. She had also never gone inside and waited for spring. She was at her work table late on the Thursday before the council meeting, a coat spread open in front of her, the lining torn out for replacement, when she heard the front door of the boarding house and then Mrs. Aldrich's voice and then another voice, lower, that she recognized even before she heard the words. Colt Mercer came to the doorway of her workroom. She did not look up from the coat immediately. She finished the length of stitching she was on, tied it off, then looked up. He looked different from the first visit, less controlled. Something in the set of his face was pulled tight in a way that didn't suggest anger exactly, more like a man who has been carrying something too heavy for too long and is beginning to feel it in his arms. I don't have an appointment with you, he said, which was an odd thing to lead with and seemed to confuse him slightly as he said it. No, she agreed. He came into the room. He looked at the coat on the table, the lamps, the organized array of her tools. Something crossed his face. Not appreciation, but maybe the recognition of the fact that this was a real business now, not something that could be dismissed. I want to talk about the council meeting, he said. All right. I want to talk about you staying out of it, he said. She held her needle and looked at him. I'm not on the council. No, he said, but you're in Wyatt Calloway's ear. Wyatt Calloway is a grown man who makes his own decisions, she said. You know what I'm trying to do with the grazing expansion, Colt said, and you've been… He stopped, choosing his words with a visible care that was unusual for him. You've been working against it. I've been talking to people, she said, about facts. Facts that you've been handed by one side of the argument. Facts from county records, she said, which anyone can access. He looked at her. The tightness in his face shifted. You know what you are in this town? He said, and the voice had changed. Not loud, but with an edge under it. You're a novelty. You're something people are curious about right now because you showed up and made a scene and people feel bad for you. That doesn't last. She kept her hand still and her voice even. I'm not a novelty, she said. I'm a businesswoman, and I'm staying. I'm trying to be reasonable with you, he said. No, she said. You're trying to scare me. She laid her needle on the table. You canceled my rafter tea contract. You interfered with my supply order. You told Wyatt to distance himself from me. That's not being reasonable. That's a campaign. His jaw tightened. And it hasn't worked, she said. So now you're here. He looked at her for a long moment. She didn't look away. You don't understand this town, he said finally, quieter. You don't know how it works. I'm learning fast, she said. He left without saying anything else. His boots on the floor, the front door, and then he was gone. She sat in the lamplight in the quiet of her workroom and she put her hands flat on the coat she was mending and she held them there until they stopped shaking. She was angry. She was also, underneath the anger, something else. The specific feeling of a person who has just understood that the situation is serious, actually serious, and is deciding anyway not to leave. She picked up her needle. She went back to work. The night before the council meeting, Wyatt came to the boarding house and they sat in the parlor. Mrs. Aldrich had made herself scarce in the particular way she had, reappearing briefly to put a lamp on the table and then vanishing again, and spread the county records copy out between them. The document was 22 years old, the ink browned at the edges, but the words perfectly clear. A rotational grazing agreement between 7 registered cattle operations in the Timberline Territory, establishing the use schedule for the eastern water access and the provisions under which it could be modified. Modification required a vote of a 2/3 majority of the original signatory's successor operations. 3 of those successor operations were Wyatt's neighbors. All 3 had already said they would oppose the expansion. "Hardin seen this?" Rebecca asked. "I gave him a copy yesterday," Wyatt said. "He didn't say much." "That means he read it." She smoothed the edge of the document. "What's his position on the land use, not the politics? Does he care about the land itself?" "He's been here 16 years, Wyatt said. "He grew up on a range that got stripped by bad grazing decisions. He knows what it looks like afterward." She looked at the document, then at Wyatt. "Tell him that," she said. "Don't talk to him about the law or the money. Talk to him about the land." She paused. "Tell him what the Eastern Range looks like in 10 years if this passes." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "That's what I know," he said. "That's what I've been trying to—" "Then say it to him in those terms," she said. "Exactly those terms. Not rancher to politician, rancher to man who's watched land die." He looked at her across the lamplit table with the document between them, and his face did the thing it did sometimes. The quiet shift, not quite readable, but clearly felt. "You should come tomorrow," he said, "to the meeting." "It's a council meeting," she said. It's open to the public," he said. "Anyone can attend. Anyone can speak if they ask to." She looked at the document. She thought about what Agnes had said about momentum. She thought about Colt standing in her workroom telling her she was a novelty. "I'll think about it," she said. She thought about it until midnight in her room upstairs, the notebook open in front of her with nothing written in it yet. She thought about what she knew and what she had witnessed and what she was willing to stand up and say in a room full of people who didn't yet know whose side she was on. She closed the notebook. She set out her best dress for morning. Not the nicest, the best, which was different, the one she'd altered herself to fit correctly because off the rack never had. And she put out her good boots and she went to sleep. Not easily, but eventually, in the particular way of a person who has made a decision that isn't comfortable but is right, and has made their peace with that distinction. The morning of the council meeting came in cold and flat, the kind of April morning in high country that can't decide if winter is finished with it yet. Rebecca was up before the light fully settled, dressed by the time Mrs. Aldrich had the stove going, at the kitchen table with her coffee and her notebook open to a blank page before she quite knew what she wanted to write on it. She wrote, "What I know to be true." Then she wrote it out. Not in the form of an argument, not in the order she would say it, just the facts themselves, stripped of commentary, the way her father had taught her to lay out the pieces of a repair job before touching anything. You look at what you have first, then you decide what to do with it. She knew the rotational agreement existed and what it said. She knew that the Eastern Range had supported 7 operations for 22 years under managed use and would not support the same or more under unrestricted expansion. She knew this not just from Wyatt's account, but from her own reading of the document and from 2 conversations she'd had, quietly and without drawing attention, with an older rancher named Delaney, whose place was 4 miles east of town, and who had been running cattle in this territory for 30 years. Delaney had talked about the land the way people talk about something they've watched go wrong before, with the specific flatness of someone describing a thing they already grieved once and did not want to grieve again. She wrote down what Delaney had told her. 2 sentences, the kind you can say in a room and have them land. She closed the notebook and finished her coffee and went to check the coat she'd been mending the night before, the one she'd left on the table, because there was a section at the leftum that had bothered her and she wanted to look at it in the morning light. It was fine. The stitching was even, and the lining lay flat, and the whole thing held together the way a well-built thing does, with the quiet solidity of work done correctly. She put on her good boots and her best coat. Not her work coat, her other one, the gray wool she'd altered herself with an extra inch at the shoulder and a higher collar. And she walked to the Timberline Town Hall in the early morning light, alone, because she had not told anyone she was going. The town hall was a single-story frame building on the north end of the main street with a painted sign above the door and a wood stove against the back wall that had been burning since before Rebecca arrived, though it hadn't quite won against the morning chill yet. There were already people inside, maybe 30, which for Timberline was a significant gathering. She recognized most of them by now, faces from her orders, from the dry goods store, from Sundays on the street. She recognized the rafter tea foreman Briggs in the back corner, looking at his hat. She recognized Agnes Pruitt, who had arrived early and taken a seat in the second row with the settled air of someone who had been watching town meetings long enough to know that position matters. She recognized Colt Mercer at the front of the room, standing near the council table with Dale Fitch and Monroe Carr, flanking him in the loose, practiced way of men who have stood beside a powerful person long enough to do it without thinking. He was talking. He had a piece of paper in his hand that he was gesturing with, not reading, just using as a prop, and he was talking to Gil Hardin, who was seated at the council table with his hands flat on the surface and his face doing nothing that gave anything away. Wyatt was near the left wall. He had the county document with him, folded in the inner pocket of his coat. She could see the edge of it. He saw her come in, and he made a small movement of acknowledgement, just a slight lift of his chin, the kind of thing only someone paying attention would catch. She chose a seat in the fourth row. Not the front. She didn't want to signal anything before she was ready, but not the back either. She sat, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. The council meeting opened with procedural business that took longer than it needed to, the way procedural business always does when somebody in the room wants to use the formality as atmosphere. Fitch read a land use summary in the measured tone of a man who has rehearsed it. Carr seconded something that didn't quite need seconding. Hardin said nothing, but wrote two things in a small notebook he produced from his vest pocket, and Rebecca watched him write them without being able to see what they were. Then Colt Mercer stood and presented his expansion plan. She had to give him credit, sitting there in her fourth row seat. He was good at this. He had a voice built for rooms, not loud exactly, but carrying, the kind of voice you feel in your chest rather than just hearing with your ears. He spoke about growth and opportunity in the language of a man who had thought about it and believed it, which was its own kind of dangerous because belief is harder to argue against than calculation. He talked about Timberline's future, about what increased cattle production could mean for the local economy, about jobs and investment, and the kind of prosperity that rises or falls with decisions made in rooms exactly like this one. He spread a hand-drawn map on the table and pointed to the eastern water access with the easy confidence of a man pointing to something that already belongs to him. He did not mention the rotational agreement. He spoke for 10 minutes and then sat down, and the room was quiet in the way of rooms that have been successfully worked. A little warmer, a little more tilted in a particular direction. Wyatt stood next. He was not as smooth as Colt, and he knew it. He didn't try to be. He spoke in plain sentences, the kind that don't flow but land solidly, and he produced the county document and laid it on the council table himself, not handing it to someone, physically walking up and setting it down, and he explained what it was and what it required in terms of modification. He said the Eastern Range had been managed under this agreement for 22 years and that the agreement existed because of what had happened to similar ranges in the region before managed use was established. He said that unrestricted expansion would yield short-term gain and long-term damage, and that the men who depended on that land would pay the cost of it long after the short-term profits were spent. He said it clearly and without embellishment, and he was done in 6 minutes. The room was quieter after Wyatt than after Colt, but it was a different kind of quiet, the kind that comes not from having been moved, but from having been made to think. Fitch leaned toward Hardin and said something low. Hardin wrote in his notebook again. Carr was looking at the map. Then Fitch said, in the moderating voice he'd been using all morning, "Is there anyone else present who wishes to address the council on this matter?" The room had a moment of that particular held breath quality. Rebecca's hands were still in her lap. She thought about Colt at the front of the room and the map on the table and the 10 minutes of confident believing. She thought about what Agnes had said about momentum. She thought about the word that on a train platform in December. She stood up. She was aware of the room shift when she stood, the slight recalibration that happens in a crowd when someone unexpected does something. She saw Colt's head turn. She saw Wyatt's face go carefully still. "My name is Rebecca Harlow," she said, to Fitch and the council table, keeping her voice at the level of the room. Not raised, just carrying. I operate a repair and alterations business in Timberline. I'd like to speak to the practical question of this land. Fitch looked at Colt, briefly and probably without meaning to. Colt said nothing. Fitch looked back at Rebecca. You may proceed. She had maybe 4 minutes before the room would start moving past her, before attention would drift the way. Attention does when someone unexpected is talking and nobody's yet sure whether to listen. She needed to use the 4 minutes exactly. She did not look at Wyatt. She did not look at Colt. She looked at Gil Harden, because Harden was the only one in this room whose mind was still open enough to be worth talking to. I've been in this town since December, she said. I came from the east, from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and before that I spent 12 years running a business. And in those 12 years, I saw 3 different kinds of commercial districts go through hard times, and I watched which ones recovered and which ones didn't. She paused, just long enough. The ones that didn't were the ones that made decisions for short-term revenue without accounting for what they were consuming to get it. Carr made a small sound. She kept going. I talked to Dan Delaney last week, she said. He's been running cattle on the Eastern Range for 30 years. He told me about the North Caldera rangeland, about 40 miles west of here, where he started out. He told me that in 1861, a similar expansion decision was made. More cattle, more access, more profit in the near term. He told me that by 1866, the grass was gone to bedrock in 3 sections, and that the operations that had bought in for those 5 years of profit had been forced to sell or move on. She let that sit. 40 miles west, 30 years ago. That land still hasn't recovered. The room was quiet. I'm not a rancher, she said. I can't speak to the technical specifics of grazing rotation the way Mr. Calloway can. But I can read a document, and I can count years, and I can tell the difference between a plan that builds something and a plan that spends something. She looked at Harden directly. That Eastern Range has been managed for 22 years under a system that works. The evidence that it works is that it's still working. What's being proposed is to spend it down for faster returns. That is not growth. That is liquidation. She sat down. The silence in the room after she sat was longer than after either Colt or Wyatt. And it was the kind of silence that is itself a sound. Not absence, but presence. The feeling of a room that has been handed something it needs to sit with. She did not look at anyone. She looked at her hands, which were completely still, which was something she had worked to achieve in the last 10 seconds of standing because they had not been still when she stood. Colt spoke again after her. He was smoother this time, or tried to be. He addressed the concerns that have been raised in the tone of a man managing a situation rather than arguing one, which was a mistake, because managing a concern implies the concern is legitimate. He talked about safeguards and monitoring and phased implementation, which were words he hadn't used the first time, which told the room he'd been improvising. Harden wrote in his notebook. The vote was called. Fitch, yes to expansion. Carr, yes to expansion. Harden sat with his hands flat on the table and the notebook closed in front of him. The room was very quiet. Colt was still at the table. He had not turned to look at the back of the room, and Rebecca understood, in the specific way she'd come to understand how he operated, that his not turning was deliberate, that looking would be a concession. Harden said, no. One word, flat and final, the way the end of something sounds. The room took it differently in different corners. She could feel it, the intake of breath in some places, the exhale in others, the particular stillness of Colt Mercer at the front of the table. The motion failed, 2-1. Fitch said something procedural that she didn't fully hear. Carr looked at his hands. Wyatt looked at the document on the council table. Then Harden stood up and crossed the room toward the back, past the rows of people, and when he got to the 4th row, he stopped and looked at Rebecca. He was a compact man, 60 or so, with a face that the outdoors had mapped comprehensively over decades. The Caldera Range, he said. It wasn't a question. Mr. Delaney described it to me, she said. Harden nodded once, the nod of a man who has confirmed something he'd already suspected. I've seen it, he said, passed through in 68. He looked at her for another moment with those outdoor mapped eyes. You said liquidation. Yes. That's the right word for it, he said. Then he put his hat on and walked out of the room. She sat in the 4th row while the room began to dissolve around her, people standing, conversations starting, the shuffling reorientation of a crowd that has seen something resolved. She felt the particular hollow aftermath of having done something that cost her something. Not regret, just the space that effort leaves behind when it's finished. Wyatt sat down in the chair beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. He retrieved the county document from the table, folded it, put it back in his inside pocket. Liquidation, he said finally, without looking at her. It felt accurate, she said. It was accurate. He was quiet another moment. That was a brave thing. It was a necessary thing, she said, which was what she actually believed. Those aren't always the same. No, he said. They're not. The walk back down Main Street after the meeting had a specific quality she hadn't anticipated, the way people were looking at her, which was different from before. Not the curiosity of the early weeks, not the complicated mixed awareness of someone who has been part of a spectacle. This was something else, more direct, the look of people deciding what to make of a thing they've just witnessed. Holt from the dry goods store came out of his shop doorway as she passed and said without preamble, "Good words, Miss Harlow." She thanked him and kept walking. Two ranch hands she recognized from the Callaway operation, Henderson was one of them, the one who'd ridden to Flagmore for the records, were coming the other direction on the sidewalk, and Henderson touched his hat brim as they passed and said, "Ma'am," with a directness that conveyed more than politeness. Agnes Pruitt caught up with her at the corner near the millinery. "You took a risk," Agnes said, falling into step. "I know," Rebecca said. "You mentioned Delaney by name." "I asked his permission first," she said. "He said yes." Agnes glanced at her sideways. "He say anything else?" "He said it was past time. Someone said it where Colt Mercer had to sit and listen," Rebecca said. Agnes made a sound that in a different person might have been a laugh. "Well," she said, "the question now is what Colt does next." That question was already sitting in Rebecca's chest like a stone she'd picked up and was deciding whether to carry. She had known, sitting in that fourth row before she stood, that standing would change things. She had known that publicly arguing against Colt's plan in a room where he was present was not a thing he would let pass without consequence. She had understood this and stood anyway, which was the decision she'd made, and she did not regret it. But Agnes was right. What Colt did next was the question. She didn't have to wait long for the answer. He came to the boarding house that same evening, not to talk this time. She heard the front door, heard Mrs. Aldrich's voice take on that particular flat tone she used when she was dealing with someone she didn't want in her house. And then she heard Colt's voice saying something about business, and it being brief, and then his boots on the floor. He came to the doorway of the workroom. She was at the table. She was always at the table in the evenings, which he would know by now, which meant he had timed this for when he knew he would find her working. He looked different again tonight. The tight, controlled expression from the night before the meeting was gone. What replaced it was harder to name. Not calm, but something that had been brought very deliberately to stillness. The way a man goes still when he's made up his mind about something and is working to contain it. "You embarrassed me," he said. She looked up from her work. "I spoke factually at a public meeting," she said, "in front of this entire town." His voice was even, which was somehow worse than raised. "You made it your business to involve yourself in something that had nothing to do with you." "The Eastern Range serves every operation in this territory," she said. "It had to do with everyone." "You've been here 4 months," he said. "You don't have the history." "I have the document," she said. "I have 30 years of Dan Delaney's history. I have eyes." She set her needle on the table. "Mr. Mercer, what happened today was a fair vote by a legitimate council on a matter of public land use. That's the process." "The process," he repeated. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. She had learned in these months to hold his gaze when he did this. Not aggressively, but steadily, the way you hold your ground on a slope when the wind pushes. "You need to understand something," he said, and now the evenness broke, just fractionally, like a crack in ice you can see without knowing how deep it goes. "I built this town. I was here before half these businesses existed. I have interests in this territory that predate every person who voted in that room today." "I don't doubt any of that," she said. "Then you understand that I'm not someone you want working against you." The sentence sat in the room. She understood it for what it was. Not quite a threat in the legal sense, but not one either. The kind of thing said in a room without witnesses that leaves no record. She thought about her notebook. She thought about the date and the time and what she would write in it after he left. "I appreciate the clarity," she said. He looked at her one more moment, then turned and walked out without another word. She heard the front door, and then the porch, and then nothing but the street sounds, and the particular quiet of a room in which something has just happened that isn't finished. She picked up her needle. She wrote in the notebook before she went back to sewing. What? Two things happened in the week after the council meeting that she hadn't predicted, and their unpredictability was its own information about how things were shifting. The first was Gil Harden. He came into her workroom on a Wednesday morning. She had begun leaving the back door propped open in warmer weather, which meant customers could come around rather than through the boarding house. And he had with him a heavy canvas jacket that needed the collar reattached and both cuffs let down, the work of someone who'd bought it for a boy who had grown unexpectedly. She took the measurements and wrote them in her order book and named him a price, and he paid half up front without being asked, which told her he intended to come back. As she was writing his name in the book, he said, "Mercer's going to be difficult for you." She looked up. "I expect so." "He's a man who doesn't lose quietly," Harden said. "You've now publicly beaten him twice, once by staying when he expected you to leave, and once at that meeting." "I spoke at a public meeting," she said. "That's not the same as beating someone." "It is to him," Harden said. He looked at her steadily. "I'm saying this not to frighten you. I'm saying it because you seem like a woman who'd rather know." "I would rather know," she said, "than know that whatever he does next, there will be people watching who remember what you said." He picked up his hat. "And who remember what he did on that train platform?" He left and she sat for a moment with that, the way it felt to be seen by someone who hadn't been there at the beginning but had paid attention anyway. The second thing was Wyatt. He often did now, without a specific stated reason, and they sat in the parlor while Mrs. Aldrich made noise in the kitchen and the evening settled in around the windows. But this time there was something different in how he came in, a kind of forward motion in his posture, like he'd been building toward something and had decided to stop delaying. He sat down. He looked at his hands, which was a gesture she associated in him with the preparation to say something he hadn't rehearsed enough. Then he looked up. "I want to tell you something," he said, "about the house." She waited. "I've been building on the south section," he said. "A house. Not the main ranch house, a new one. Started it about 2 years ago." He was choosing his words with a care that was unusual for him, the man who as a rule said exactly what he meant in the fewest words needed. "I've been building it." He stopped. Started again. "The doorways are taller than standard," he said. "The main bedroom doorway. The kitchen. I had Henderson cut them extra high when we framed it." He said this last thing looking directly at her, without flinching from it. She held very still. "That's—" She didn't have the right word immediately. "I'm not telling you because I expect anything," he said quickly, in the tone of a man who has thought about how this might land and is trying to get ahead of the wrong interpretation. "I'm telling you because I think you should know, because after what happened this week, after what you did in that meeting—" He stopped again, the careful word-choosing again. "I don't want you to not know." She thought about a man building a house 2 years ago, framing doorways at a height that a normal-sized person would never think about. And she thought about letters written for 8 months to a different man and how thoroughly wrong she had been about what she was walking toward when she stepped off that train. "Show me," she said. He looked at her. "The house," she said. "Show it to me. When the work's at a point where it makes sense to see it." He nodded. The careful look was still there, but underneath it was something else, something less guarded than his usual. "It's near enough," he said. "All right," she said. They sat a while longer after that, talking about nothing in particular. The weather coming, the condition of the south pasture, whether Henderson's horse was going to keep being difficult or eventually make peace with the world. Normal conversation, the kind that fills the space around the things that matter, and somehow, in doing so, makes those things feel more real rather than less. She walked him to the porch when he left, which she sometimes did and sometimes didn't, and the evening air was cold but not sharp, and the sky above timberline had that enormous quality. It got in clear weather, the stars pressing down close against the mountains. He put his hat on at the bottom of the porch steps. He stood there a moment. "Rebecca," he said. "Yes." "What you did in that room today." He seemed to decide against whatever he'd started to say. Instead, I'm glad you stayed. In December. I'm glad you didn't get back on the train. She looked at him in the starlight. So am I, she said, and meant it the way she said it, plainly, without extra weight, but truly. He went down the path toward his horse. She stayed on the porch until the sound of hooves faded into the night, and then she went back inside. So, the trouble began on a Saturday, 17 days after the council meeting, in a form she hadn't quite anticipated. She had gone to collect payment from a ranch hand named Cress, who'd had 3 shirts altered and had said he'd stop by the end of the week, which he hadn't. And she'd sent word, and still nothing, so she had walked the quarter-mile to the bunkhouse at the edge of town where several unattached hands roomed. She was not aggressive about collections. She kept careful records and gave fair time. But she also had a business to run, and she had learned that being soft about money invited people to mistake softness for acceptance. Cress was there. He paid without much discussion, slightly embarrassed, slightly resentful in the way of people who have been caught out on something small. Fine. She took the money, counted it, wrote it in her book, and was turning to go when she heard voices through the thin wall from the room next door. She recognized Colt's voice first. She recognized the other one a moment later. It was Monroe Carr, from the council, and his voice had that back corner quality of someone not performing for the room but meaning the words for the person beside them. She did not stop walking. She kept moving toward the door. But the wall was thin, and in the moment she passed the partition she heard Carr say, "The contract argument won't hold up, but the correspondence angle." And Colt, "She signed. That's the thing. She signed letters that any court could read as..." The door was in front of her. She went through it. She stood in the spring morning air on the dirt path outside the bunkhouse, and she held what she'd just heard in her mind, and she turned it over carefully, the way she turned a piece of damaged leather, looking for the exact location of the problem. She signed. The letters. The mail-order letters. 8 months of them, written in good faith to a man who had promised honest dealing. She walked back to the boarding house at a steady pace. She went upstairs to her room. She opened the trunk at the foot of the bed and lifted the tray that held her sewing materials. And underneath, in the bottom of the trunk where she had put them the night she packed in Harrisburg, were the letters. All of them. His letters and her drafts. She always kept drafts. And the original advertisement from the magazine. She sat on the bed and read through every one of them in order, beginning to end, with the specific attention of someone no longer reading for feeling but for language, for what the words said and what they could be made to say if a person was willing to say them badly. She was there for 2 hours. When she finished, she had a clear picture. Her letters were plain-spoken and unambiguous. She had been careful, it turned out, even without knowing she needed to be. The kind of careful that comes from spending your life dealing with the practical consequences of words. There was nothing in her correspondence that constituted a legal agreement, nothing that committed her to anything more than the willingness to travel and meet. Her final letter, accepting the arrangement, was equally clear. She was agreeing to come and consider the matter in person, not to be bound by contract. His letters were a different question. His letters made certain representations about the arrangement, about the terms, about what he was offering. She read those with particular care. When she was finished, she knew something important. If Colt Mercer tried to argue legal obligation from these letters, he would be arguing from letters he had written that documented his own promises and his own subsequent failure to honor them. He would be standing in a court presenting evidence of the thing he'd done on that platform. She put the letters back in the bottom of the trunk, under the tray. She put the trunk lid down. She sat on the edge of the bed and thought for a while about Colt Mercer at the council table, and Colt Mercer in the bunkhouse, and Colt Mercer on the platform in December, and she thought about the particular arithmetic of men who confuse power with permanence. Then she went downstairs, put on her work apron, and told herself she had work to do. But before she picked up her needle, she wrote 2 things in her notebook: the date and the words "keep all letters secure." She was going to need them. She had not told Wyatt what she'd heard through the bunkhouse wall. She had turned it over for 3 days first, the way she turned difficult repairs over, examining the damage from every angle before deciding on the approach. She was not a woman who shared information carelessly, and she knew that what she'd heard was a fragment, not a complete picture, and that a fragment interpreted wrongly could cause more harm than silence. So she kept it in her chest like a stone while she worked, while she took in orders and stitched and waxed and delivered, while she smiled at the customers who came through her back door and wrote every transaction in her notebook with the careful precision that had become, without her fully deciding it, a form of armor. On the fourth day, she told him. He was in the parlor, the same chair, the hat on his knee in that way he had, when she sat across from him and said plainly what she'd heard through the partition, Carr's voice, Colt's voice, the words she signed and correspondence angle in any court could read as. She said it the way she'd have described a piece of damaged gear. Here's the problem. Here's where the damage is. Here's what I think it means. Wyatt listened without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He's going to file something, he said. That's what I think too. On the basis of the letters. Trying to argue legal obligation, she said. Breach of arrangement. Possibly claim I'm here under false pretense, that I represent some kind of liability to his name. She paused. I don't know exactly what the argument will look like, but I've read every letter and I know what's in them. And his letters are going to be more useful to me in a courtroom than mine are going to be to him, she said. He made representations. I made none that a reasonable person could read as binding contract. Wyatt looked at her steadily. You're sure? I spent 2 hours reading them with that specific question in mind, she said. Yes. He let out a breath. Not relief exactly, more like the exhale of a man who has been holding a weight and just found out the weight is manageable, not light, but manageable. You kept them, he said. The letters. I kept everything, she said. He nodded. He turned his hat once on his knee. I need to write to my brother, he said. He practices law in Faro. That would be good, she said. And you need to stop keeping that packet in your trunk. She looked at him. He knows where you live, Wyatt said. And if he's willing to argue a court case, he's willing to do other things to improve his position before it gets to court. He met her eyes without apology for how plain the words were. Those letters need to be somewhere he can't reach them. Not your room, not this building. She had thought about this already. Had thought about it and pushed it away, because the idea that someone might go through her trunk, through her mother's thimble and her father's folded patterns and all the private material of a life packed into one container made something rise in her chest that was harder to manage than anger. But Wyatt was right, and she knew it. I could put them with Agnes, she said. Does he have any relationship with Agnes? None that I know of. Then Agnes, he said. Oh. She went to Agnes Pruitt the next morning with the letters in a flat envelope sealed with wax. She had a wax kit. She used it for customers' private correspondence occasionally. And Agnes took the envelope with the directness of a woman who had been trusted with things before and knew what that meant. Don't tell me what's in it, Agnes said. I wasn't going to, Rebecca said. Agnes put the envelope in the back of her bottom drawer under a bolt of winter wool. If you need it quickly, she said. Come any time. I'm here before 7 and after 9. Thank you, Rebecca said. Don't thank me yet, Agnes said. Thank me when this is finished. She looked at Rebecca over the tops of her glasses. He's going to move soon. When a man like that loses twice, the third move comes fast. She was right about the timing. The notice came 8 days later. It arrived at Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house, delivered by a young man Rebecca didn't recognize, who presented it without meeting her eyes, and left before she could ask him anything. She stood in the entryway and opened it, and read it standing up, because sitting down felt like conceding something. Notice of legal claim. In the matter of Mercer v. Harlow, Timberline Territorial Court, claimant Colt J. Mercer asserts that the respondent Rebecca A. Harlow entered into a formal arrangement of marriage with the claimant through correspondence conducted between February and October of the prior year, which correspondence constitutes a binding agreement of settlement and cohabitation, and that the respondent's presence in Timberline and conduct therein represents both a breach of said agreement and a claim upon the claimant's reputation and standing. Claimant seeks order of removal from the territory and damages. She stopped reading. She read the last part again. Order of removal from the territory. He was trying to have her expelled, not just from Timberline, from the territory. This was not a legal argument about letters and agreements. This was an attempt to use the court as a mechanism for doing what his supply interference and his rafter tea cancellation and his bunkhouse conversations had failed to accomplish, getting her gone. She folded the notice back into its envelope with steady hands. She was calm in the way she was calm when something broke in the shop. Not unaffected, but focused, the feeling narrowing down to the thing in front of her. She went to the parlor and she sat down and she got out her notebook and she wrote the date and the words, "Notice received," and then she sat for a long time and did not write anything else. Mrs. Aldrich appeared in the doorway with coffee she hadn't asked for, set it on the table beside her and left without speaking, which was exactly right. Wyatt came that evening with his brother's letter. James Calloway was 3 years older than Wyatt and had been practicing territorial law in Faro for 11 years. Wyatt read the relevant section aloud. His brother had seen correspondence-based marriage claims argued in territorial courts before. They were difficult cases, he wrote, because territorial law was not consistent on the question of whether a mail-order arrangement constituted a legal contract before the marriage itself occurred. Some judges read the exchange of letters as a binding agreement of intent. Others read it as a social arrangement without legal force until vows were taken. "It depends on the judge," Wyatt said, setting the letter down. "Which judge?" Rebecca asked. "Arlen Hicks," he said. "He's the circuit judge for this territory. He'll ride in from Whitmore next month." "Do you know him?" "Not personally." He paused. "James does. He says Hicks is fair but conservative. He doesn't like wasted time, and he doesn't like frivolous claims. But he'll take this seriously because Colt's filed it formally." Rebecca put her hand flat on her notebook. "James needs to see the letters," she said. "Both sets. I wrote him that." "He needs to see them before the hearing date," she said. "Not just before the trial. Before the hearing, so he can assess whether to argue the substance or challenge the claim's standing." Wyatt looked at her. "You've thought about this." "I've been thinking about little else for 8 days," she said. He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile she'd seen on him. A slight shift at the corner of his mouth that lasted about 2 seconds and then was gone. "James can be here by the end of next week if I write him now." "Write him tonight," she said. He did. He borrowed her pen and her writing paper at the table in her workroom, which felt strange and right in equal measure. This practical man using her things to write a letter that might determine whether she got to stay in the town where she had built something real from nothing, and doing it without drama, just writing, carefully, in the hand of a man who wrote infrequently and meant every word. She watched him write and thought about the house on the south section and the tall doorways and the 2 years of quiet intention they represented. And she thought that whatever happened in the courtroom next month, she knew something now about what things looked like when they were built right. The notice had gotten out, as notices do in small towns, faster than she'd have liked. By the following morning, 3 people had mentioned it to her directly, and several more had given her the sideways look of people who know something and are deciding whether to say it. She handled it the same way each time. She didn't deny and she didn't amplify. She said simply that the matter was being handled through the appropriate legal channels, and she appreciated people's concern, and would they like their order ready by Thursday or Friday, which meant that by noon most people in Timberline understood simultaneously that she knew about the claim, that she wasn't running, and that she expected her work to continue normally. Clara Devlin came on Wednesday. She didn't come with a sewing order. She came with a jar of preserved peaches and the look of a woman who has decided to be direct. "I wanted to come sooner," she said. "My husband said to wait. I didn't want to wait anymore." "I'm glad you came," Rebecca said. Clara sat down at the kitchen table, which was where they always ended up talking, and she folded her hands around the peach jar in the way of someone who needs something to hold. "Mercer talked to my husband," she said, "about the order we placed with you last spring." Rebecca kept her face level. "What did he say?" "He suggested that the homesteaders who supported you at the council meeting might have trouble with their water access applications this season." Clara's voice was steady, but her hands tightened slightly on the jar. "He was talking about the irrigation permits. He has some connection to the land office through one of the county commissioners." Rebecca sat with this. "He told your husband this directly?" "He was careful with his words," Clara said, "but the meaning was clear." She thought about Hardin in the courtroom. She thought about Agnes's envelope in the bottom drawer. She thought about what it took to be the kind of man who threatened a homesteader's water permit because of a connection to a woman who sewed saddles. "Is your husband frightened?" she said. Clara looked at her honestly. "Yes," she said. "He's also angry. He told me he'd rather do the right thing and fight for the permit than do the wrong thing and drink that water." She paused. But I wanted you to know what was being used. I'm glad I know, Rebecca said. And please tell your husband that whatever happens in that courtroom, the water permit issue is a separate matter, and there are people who will help him fight it if it comes to that. She met Clara's eyes. He's not alone in this. Clara nodded. She left the jar of peaches on the table. James Calloway arrived on a Friday, 9 days before the hearing date. He was not what Rebecca had expected, which meant she had been unconsciously expecting some version of Wyatt and had been wrong. James was louder, easier in company, with a readiness to talk that his brother entirely lacked, and a mind that moved fast and said so. He shook her hand at Mrs. Aldrich's front door with the frank assessment of a man who forms opinions quickly and trusts them. You have the letters? He said by way of greeting. At Agnes Pruitt's millinery, she said. I'll bring them when you're ready to work. Tonight, he said, before anything else. They sat around the parlor table, James, Wyatt, Rebecca, and Mrs. Aldrich, who had again made herself nominally absent by sitting in the kitchen doorway with her mending where she could hear everything. And Rebecca laid the letters out chronologically, her drafts on the left, Colt's originals on the right, the initial advertisement at the top. James read them in order, and he read them fast, and he did not say anything until he was finished. Then he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. These are his letters, he said, tapping Colt's stack. Yes, Rebecca said. These are your drafts. I always kept drafts. He looked at her. Your drafts are exceptionally clear, he said. There is nothing in here that a reasonable reading would call contractual. You stated repeatedly that you were coming to assess the situation in person. You never agreed to the marriage. You agreed to the meeting. That was my intention, she said. His letters, James said, are a different matter. He spread 3 of Colt's pages on the table. Here he describes the arrangement as settled. Here he uses the phrase, when you arrive as my wife. Here's, he pointed to the 3rd letter. He says, and I quote, I consider this decided between us, and I'll hold to it. That's the language of a man who believed a contract existed. He looked at Rebecca. Which means he can't now argue that you are bound by a contract without simultaneously proving that he represented one existed and then failed to honor it. That's what I thought, Rebecca said. You thought right, James said, without flattery, just confirmation. If he argues correspondence as contract, his own letters become the evidence of his breach, not yours. He leaned forward. What I need to know is whether Judge Hicks will let me argue that this claim should be dismissed before trial on the grounds that it constitutes harassment and abuse of process. Can you argue that? Wyatt said. I can argue it, James said. Whether Hicks accepts it depends on his tolerance for exactly this kind of claim. He paused. My read of Hicks is that he doesn't like his courtroom being used as a blunt instrument, but he'll want to see the substance before he makes that call, which means we go in prepared to argue both, procedural dismissal on standing and substantive defense on the merits. What do you need from me? Rebecca said. I need everything you remember, James said. Every conversation with Mercer since December. Everything he said, everything he did. The supply interference, the rafter tea cancellation, what you heard through the bunkhouse wall. I need it in your words, in order, and I need you to tell me where you're not certain so I know what I can state and what I have to be careful with. She had the notebook. She pulled it from her apron pocket and set it on the table. James looked at it, then at her. How long have you been keeping this? Since the 2nd week I was here, she said. He picked it up. He opened it. He read the first entry, then 3 others at random. Then he set it down with the specific care of a person handling something valuable. Miss Harlow, he said, you may have just made my job considerably easier. The 9 days before the hearing had a quality of controlled tension that Rebecca managed by working harder than she needed to. She took every order, filled every job on time, collected every payment, wrote every transaction in the book. She was not going to be found in arrears. She was not going to give anyone, any observer, any member of the town, any future judge reviewing circumstances, a reason to describe her as struggling or unstable or less than fully established. She was building something and she intended to be found building it. Wyatt came every evening. They talked about the case and about other things and sometimes about nothing in particular, and he stayed later than he had before, which she noticed and didn't comment on. And sometimes when he left, she stood at the window and watched his horse move down the street toward the south road and felt something she had gotten better at not analyzing too much, because some things hold more clearly when you don't press them. Colt was visible in town in those 9 days in a way he hadn't been before. Not avoiding her, not approaching her, just present, appearing at the hardware store, or the feed store, or the main street, looking the way men look when they want to be seen to be unconcerned. She passed him twice. Both times he looked at her with the even expression that she now recognized as his version of control, the face he wore when he was working hard not to show what was underneath it. She showed nothing back. She nodded once, the second time, in the way of a person acknowledging another person's presence without granting it weight. He did not nod back. On the Saturday before the hearing, Wyatt came in the middle of the day instead of the evening, and he came differently, purposeful in a way that was almost fidgety, which was so unlike him that it registered immediately. "I want to show you the house," he said. She had been waiting for this since the night he told her about it. She had been careful not to press, understanding instinctively that for a private man like Wyatt, the offer to show something built in private was its own kind of statement, and rushing it would ruin the quality of the thing. She put down her work. She got her coat. They rode out on the South Road in the spring afternoon, the country opening up around them, the way it does when you move out of a town's frame and into the plain fact of the landscape. Big and particular, the mountains still snow-capped against the blue, the grass coming in green along the lower slopes. She was not a woman who had spent much time on horseback before December, and she had gotten better at it without becoming natural at it, which Wyatt had never commented on, though she knew he'd noticed. The house was at the end of a track off the South Road, on a rise that looked over the river bend. It was not finished. That was the first thing she understood clearly. It was further along than she'd half imagined, with the framing complete and the exterior boards up and the roof solid. But the inside was still raw work in progress, the floors not yet laid in 2 of the rooms, one wall not yet chinked. It smelled of cut wood and the particular clean cold of new construction. Wyatt was watching her look at it. She walked to the main door. She went through it without ducking, without turning her head, without the slight automatic adjustment she had made 10,000 times in 10,000 doorways in her life. She just walked through. She stopped in the entryway. She stood there for a moment with the late afternoon light coming through the window openings and the smell of new wood all around. And she thought about a man measuring doorways 2 years ago. Not measuring for a specific person, she understood, because 2 years ago he hadn't known her, but measuring for the possibility of a specific person, the shape of a woman who could exist, who might exist, who he had decided to leave room for just in case she did. "Every doorway," she said. "Every one," he said from just behind her. She turned around and looked at him. He was standing in the doorway himself, not filling it because he was a lean man, but solid in it. And he had his hat in his hand and his face was doing the unguarded thing it occasionally did when he forgot to keep it managed. "Wyatt," she said, "I know the timing's not—" He started. "Stop," she said. Not harshly, just the way you stop someone from apologizing for something that doesn't need an apology. He stopped. She looked at him for a moment. The light was going. Somewhere outside, a bird was doing something persistent and cheerful that didn't know or care about courts or correspondence or men who stood on platforms and said the wrong thing. She thought about December and she thought about now, and the distance between those two things was not a straight line. It was a landscape, with all of a landscape's difficulty and surprise. "When this is finished," she said, "I want to talk about this properly." "When it's finished," he said. She nodded. She looked at the unfinished floor, the raw wall. "The kitchen doorway," she said, for something practical to say. "Come see," he said. She followed him through the half-finished rooms, and he showed her what was done and what was left, and they talked about it the way people talk about work, in the language of specific things and practical considerations. And it was the right conversation to have in that place at that moment. And she felt, walking through those rooms with their extra tall doorways, something that was the opposite of being expelled from somewhere. She felt like someone who had already arrived. The morning of the hearing was cold for May, with a hard wind off the northern peaks that had everyone on the street moving fast and tucked into their coats. Rebecca was up at 5. She dressed in her best dress, the dark blue wool she'd made herself 5 years ago and altered twice, and which fit her better than anything she owned. And she put up her hair, and she sat at the edge of her bed for a while with her hands in her lap and let herself feel the thing she'd been managing all week, which was the plain fact of being afraid. Not afraid of the courtroom. Not entirely afraid of losing, even, though she was afraid of that. Afraid of the shape of what would happen if it went wrong. What it would feel like to have built something and had it taken. What it would mean to stand on the platform again, but this time without a choice about the train. She sat with it for 10 minutes. She let it be what it was. Then she stood up, put on her coat, and went downstairs. Mrs. Aldrich was at the stove. She turned when Rebecca came in and looked at her the way she had that first evening, the measuring look of a woman who reads people. And then she turned back to the stove and said, "Sit down." Rebecca sat. Mrs. Aldrich put a plate in front of her. "Eat," she said. Rebecca ate. "He has more money and more connections," Mrs. Aldrich said at the stove. "And none of that is the same as being right." "I know," Rebecca said. "I watched this town bow to him for 15 years, Mrs. Aldrich said. "Not everyone, but enough." She turned around. Her face was its usual direct self, not soft, but not cold either. "You didn't, even when it would have been easier." She nodded at the plate. "Finish." Rebecca finished. She walked to the territorial courthouse, a newer building on the East Street, single story, surprisingly formal for Timberline in its white-painted exterior and its modest columns that seemed like someone's aspiration toward permanence. James was already there, on the steps, with a leather case, and the particular alert expression of a man whose mind was already in the room. Wyatt was beside him. She came up the steps between them. "Ready?" James said. "Yes," she said. The three of them went inside. The room was fuller than she'd expected. Timberline was not a large town, but its people had come. She saw Agnes in the second row, and Clara Devlin beside her, and Hardin near the back wall, and Holt from the dry goods store, and Henderson and two other Callaway hands, and half a dozen ranch wives she recognized from orders, and more faces she knew well enough to read, people who had brought their coats here on a cold May morning because they wanted to see how this came out. Colt was at the claimant's table with a lawyer she didn't recognize, a broad-shouldered man from out of town who had the confident posture of someone who's been paid well to be confident. Rebecca sat at the respondent's table beside James, and she put her hands flat on the table surface and she looked at the empty chair at the front of the room where Judge Arlen Hicks would sit. She waited. The bailiff called the room to order. The judge came in. He was older than she'd imagined, mid-60s, compact and gray-haired, with the face of a man who had heard a great many things in courtrooms and had learned to treat his own reactions as irrelevant to the proceedings. He sat. He looked at the papers before him. He looked at the room. "Mercer versus Harlow," he said. "This court is in session. Mr. Dalton, you represent the claimant," the broad-shouldered lawyer confirmed. "Mr. Callaway, you represent the respondent," James confirmed. "Very well, Mr. Dalton. As this is the claimant's action, you will open. Keep it to what the record needs. I have read the preliminary filing, and I have questions of my own before we're done." Dalton stood. And Rebecca Harlow, sitting at a table in the Timberline Territorial Courthouse with her hands flat and still on the surface, and every letter she had written and received in the past year available to be called as evidence, looked at the judge and breathed and waited and prepared to speak the truth she had been carrying since December. She was not finished here. She had not even fully started. Dalton opened with confidence, the kind that costs money and sounds like it. He laid out Colt Mercer's claim in the measured cadence of a man who had arranged facts the way a set designer arranges furniture, for effect, not for truth. He spoke about the correspondence, about the 8 months of letters, about what he called a mutual understanding of settlement and intent. He used the phrase reasonable expectation 4 times. He used the word honor twice, which Rebecca noted with a specific internal quiet, the way you note a wrong note in music. He presented 3 of Colt's letters as exhibits, carefully selected, the ones with the most formal language, the ones that could, if read in isolation, suggest the shape of a contract. He did not present Rebecca's letters. He did not present the letter where Colt had written, "Tall is fine by me." He did not mention the train platform. When Dalton finished, Judge Hicks looked at the exhibits for a long moment. Then he looked at James Callaway. "Counselor." James stood. I was quieter than Dalton, which Rebecca had come to understand was intentional. He used the room's attention rather than filling it. He said that the respondent would demonstrate, through the full correspondence between the parties, that no binding agreement of marriage had ever been established, that the respondent had been explicit in her letters about the conditional nature of her travel, and that the claimant had himself breached any reasonable understanding of arrangement on the day of the respondent's arrival by publicly and categorically rejecting her before witnesses on the Timberline station platform. He paused there. Let that sit. The claimant cannot simultaneously argue that a binding agreement existed and that he was entitled to dissolve it unilaterally upon visual inspection of the respondent, James said. These positions are incompatible. The court will have to choose which one describes reality. We submit that the record will make that choice straightforward. Hicks wrote something. He did not look up when he wrote it, which meant he'd already been thinking it. Call your first witness, Mr. Dalton, he said. Dalton called Colt Mercer. Colt took the witness chair with the ease of a man who had rehearsed. He was wearing his best coat, and his good hat was on the table beside his lawyer, and he sat straight and answered Dalton's questions in the careful voice of a man choosing each word, describing the correspondence as he understood it, describing his intentions, describing the arrangement as he had believed it to be. He was convincing. She would not lie to herself about that. He was a man who had lived in the skin of certainty long enough that certainty had become native to him, and it came through even here, even making an argument she knew was wrong. Then James stood for cross-examination. He asked Colt to confirm, in his own words, what he had said on the platform in December. Colt confirmed it, carefully, framing it as a moment of surprise and honest reaction. James asked whether he had purchased a return ticket for the respondent prior to her arrival. Colt said yes. James asked whether that meant he had already considered the possibility of rejecting her before she stepped off the train. Colt's jaw tightened fractionally. He said he had been cautious. James asked whether cautious was consistent with the letter he had written describing the arrangement as decided between us, the letter Dalton had submitted as Exhibit B. Colt said those were two different things. James said that was exactly the respondent's point. Hicks made another note. James asked Colt to look at Exhibit F, which was a letter James had submitted, not Dalton, one of Colt's own letters, the one where he had written, "Tall is fine by me." He asked Colt whether that was his handwriting. Colt confirmed it. James asked whether the respondent had, in her initial letter, informed the claimant that she was a tall woman. Colt confirmed it. James asked whether the claimant had responded that height was acceptable to him. Colt said yes. James asked whether the claimant had then rejected the respondent on the basis of her height, in public, upon her arrival. The room was very quiet. "You were surprised," James said. "Yes," Colt said. "You had been informed," James said. "You had confirmed it was acceptable, and then you were surprised." He paused. "What precisely surprised you, Mr. Mercer, if not the information you already had?" Colt looked at his lawyer. Dalton said nothing. "I thought it would be different in person," Colt said. The same words he'd said to Rebecca that first afternoon in her workroom. "Different from what you'd been told," James said. "Different from what you'd agreed to." "I didn't agree." "Exhibit B," James said, and held up the letter. "You wrote that you considered the arrangement decided. Were those your words?" "Yes." "Then what you are telling this court is that you considered the arrangement decided when it suited you and not decided when it did not." James set the letter down. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer." He sat. The room exhaled. Not dramatically. This was not a theater, but the particular breath of a group of people who have been holding something and just released it. Rebecca was called next. She walked to the witness chair and sat down and looked at Judge Hicks, because he was the only person in the room who mattered at this moment. And he looked back at her with the even expression of a man who had heard many things and reserved judgment on all of them until the appropriate time. James led her through the correspondence chronologically. Her initial letter, the 8 months of exchange, her final acceptance of the arrangement as a conditional meeting, not a binding promise. She answered his questions in plain sentences, the way she kept her notebook: date, fact, language. She did not editorialize. She did not perform. She said what was true in the words that were accurate and left the room to draw its own conclusions. Then Dalton stood for cross. He was sharper now, having been hurt by James's cross of Colt. He asked whether she had traveled to Timberline with the intention of marriage. She said she had traveled with the intention of meeting the claimant and making a mutual decision. He asked whether she had represented herself as available for marriage. She said she had represented herself as open to the possibility of a fair arrangement with a man of honest character, which was the language she had used in her first letter, which he could refer to. He did refer to it. He read it aloud. He asked whether that language constituted availability for marriage. It constitutes what it says, she said, open to possibility, not committed to certainty. He shifted angles. He asked about her remaining in Timberline after the claimant's rejection. He suggested that her continued presence had damaged the claimant's reputation and created a false impression in the community about the nature of their relationship. She looked at him directly. I remained in Timberline because I had the right to, she said. I opened a business. I served the community. I did not discuss my arrangement with the claimant publicly. I did not make claims about our correspondence, and I did not represent our situation in any way that was inaccurate. She paused. The claimant discussed the situation publicly on the day of my arrival, not me. Dalton moved to redirect the question. Hicks stopped him. I have questions of my own, the judge said. Dalton sat. Hicks looked at Rebecca. He had the quality of a man whose intelligence operated without announcement. Miss Harlow, he said, you kept your correspondence. Yes. All of it. Yes. Including your own drafts. I always kept drafts, she said. He looked at the stack of letters on the evidence table, both sets, every one of them, entered as the respondent's exhibits. You began keeping a written record of your activities and interactions in Timberline, he said. You have submitted that record as evidence. When did you begin keeping it? The second week I was here, she said, before any legal action was initiated. By approximately 4 months, she said. He studied her for a moment. Why? He said. Not unfriendly, genuinely curious, in the way of a man trying to understand the shape of a person in front of him. She considered the question honestly before answering. Because I was a woman alone in an unfamiliar town in a situation that had already gone wrong once, she said. I've run a business for 12 years. I know what happens to people who don't keep records. He nodded once, slowly. He wrote something. Thank you, he said. You may step down. Juan. Hicks did not take long. He asked both lawyers to approach the bench, and he spoke with them in the low, direct voice of a man who has made up his mind and is telling you what it is. Rebecca could not hear the words. She watched James's face, which remained professionally neutral, and Dalton's face, which did not. She watched the particular quality of stillness that came over Colt's shoulders when Dalton returned to the table, the way a man's body acknowledges something before his face is ready to. Hicks looked out at the room. In the matter of Mercer versus Harlow, he said, this court finds the following. The correspondence submitted in evidence does not constitute a binding legal agreement of marriage. The respondent's letters are explicit in their conditional language. The claimant's letters, while using language of certainty, describe an arrangement the claimant himself dissolved upon the respondent's arrival, which by any reasonable legal standard constitutes a waiver of whatever claim those letters might otherwise represent. He paused. He looked at Colt directly. This court further finds that the action as filed represents an attempt to use legal process to compel the removal of a person who has established lawful residence and legitimate business in this territory, against whom no credible legal claim exists. That is an abuse of this court's process, and this court takes a dim view of it. Another pause. The claim is dismissed in its entirety. The respondent is confirmed in her right to remain in Timberline territory. Costs are awarded against the claimant. He closed the file in front of him. We're done. The room did not erupt. It wasn't that kind of room. But there was movement, a collective shift, the sound of breath and boots, and the specific human noise of people who have witnessed something and are processing it. Agnes, in the second row, sat with her hands in her lap and her face composed, and the only indication of what she felt was a single slow nod directed at no one in particular. Clara Devlin had her hand over her mouth. Hardin, at the back wall, was looking at his boots. Colt Mercer sat at his table for a moment after Hicks left the bench. He sat very still, his hands flat on the table, and Rebecca watched him from across the room with the complicated feeling of a person who has been wronged by someone and has seen that wrong addressed but cannot feel entirely clean about it because there is no version of this that leaves everyone whole. She had not wanted this. She had wanted to sow saddles and build a business and find out what she was capable of in new country. None of this had been her design. He stood. He picked up his hat. He looked across the room at her, the first time he had looked directly at her since the proceedings began, and she held his gaze the way she had learned to, steadily and without aggression, just looking. Whatever he saw in her face, she could not control. She knew what she was trying to say with it, which was nothing, not victory, not contempt, just the simple fact of being still here. He turned and walked out. His lawyer followed. The room breathed again. James touched her arm briefly. "Well done," he said. "You did the work," she said. "You kept the records," he said. "I did not make those letters. I did not start that notebook in your second week here. I did not talk to Delaney, and I did not stand up at the council meeting, and I did not refuse to get back on the train in December." He picked up his leather case. "I argued the case. You built it." She did not answer, because she was not sure what to say to that, but she held it, the way you hold something given to you that is more valuable than you'd prepared for. Wyatt was beside her then, not saying anything, just there, and she let herself feel the full weight of the morning settle into the ordinary fact of standing in a room where the worst had not happened. So, Colt Mercer left Timberline 3 weeks later. He did not announce it. He did not make a speech or offer explanations. He sold the Riverbend property to a rancher from the South County at a price that people said was below what the land was worth, which told you something about the urgency of the transaction. He loaded 2 wagons and rode out on a Tuesday morning before most of the town was awake. And by noon, the fact of his absence was a thing people discussed not with triumph, but with the slightly subdued quality of a community that has expelled someone and is still deciding how it feels about having needed to. Rebecca heard from Pearl, who heard from the stable master, who had watched the wagons go. She was mending a pair of chaps when Pearl told her, and she put the chaps down and sat with it for a moment. She had expected to feel something cleaner than what she felt. What she actually felt was more complicated, a tiredness mostly, the specific exhaustion that comes not from work, but from sustained alertness, the kind of watching you do when you know a storm hasn't passed yet. She had been in that vigilant state for 5 months. It was strange to have it lift. Strange and not entirely comfortable, the way it is strange and uncomfortable to put down a weight you've been carrying long enough that the weight has become the baseline. She picked up the chaps and went back to work. Clara Devlin came by that afternoon. She came often now, no longer with a sewing order as the pretext, just to sit in the workroom and talk while Rebecca worked, which was a form of friendship that suited them both. She brought her knitting. She sat in the chair Wyatt usually occupied in the evenings, and they talked about Colt's departure and about the irrigation permits, which had gone through without interference the previous week, now that whatever leverage he'd implied had evaporated with his local presence. "My husband said a thing last night," Clara said. She was looking at her knitting, not at Rebecca. "What did he say?" "He said that watching what you did this winter, the council meeting, the courtroom, he said it reminded him of why he came out here in the first place." She paused, turned her work. "He said people forget that this country was built by people who decided to stay when leaving would have been easier." Rebecca kept her eyes on the chaps. "Your husband is a thoughtful man," she said. "He has his moments," Clara said, with the dry warmth of a woman who loves someone without illusion. Rebecca thought about that for the rest of the afternoon, about the specific arithmetic of staying, about what it costs and what it builds, and how those two things are not always proportional. Sometimes you pay more than you get back, and sometimes what you get back is not what you expected when you decided to pay it. She had not stayed in Timberline because she was brave. She had stayed because leaving felt like a lie, and she had never been good at lying, not even to herself. She had been humiliated on a platform, and she had been frightened, and she had been interfered with and threatened and taken to court by a man who had too much power and too little self-knowledge, and none of it had been fair, and the unfairness of it had never stopped being true just because she'd found a way through it. That was the thing she thought nobody talked about honestly enough. The fact that doing right doesn't make the wrong thing not have happened. The platform was still real. The letters were still real. The 5 months of vigilance and the canceled contracts and the bunkhouse conversation through the thin wall were all still real, and they would remain real regardless of how well things ended. The ending doesn't revise the story. It just adds to it. What she had was not an erasure of those months. What she had was everything that came after them, and the knowledge that she had built it herself, with her own hands, from materials she'd brought with her when she had nothing else. That was enough. More than enough. It was, in fact, everything. Wyatt came on a Wednesday evening in early June, when the days had gotten long enough that the light was still good at 7 o'clock and the air had finally committed to warmth without the daily reminder of the altitude's cold. He came without the hat-in-hand routine, without the careful preparation she'd come to associate with him when he had something significant to say. He came the way he'd come for months, just present, just himself. But he'd brought something. He set it on her work table. It was a piece of wood, cut smooth, about the length of her forearm, with something carved into it. She picked it up. It took her a moment to understand what she was looking at. It was the door header from the main entrance of the south house, cut with the finished height marked on it. The measurement was carved in neat numbers. She did not look at the number immediately. She looked at Wyatt. "The house is ready?" he said. "Near enough." "Near enough," she said. He looked at his hands, then at her. "I've been thinking about how to say this," he said. "I've been thinking about it for a while, actually. And I've come to the conclusion that I'm not going to say it particularly well, so I'm going to say it anyway." "All right," she said. "I'd like you to see the house properly," he said. "Not as a curiosity. Not to show you the doorways. I'd like you to see it because I built it for someone to live in, and I'd like that someone to be you, if you're willing." He paused. "I'm not talking about an arrangement. I'm not talking about a contract." He met her eyes. "I'm talking about asking you to marry me because I want to, because you're the most honest person I've met in this territory, and you make me think better than I think without you, and I would like to spend a long time watching you be exactly who you are." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about a February night in Harrisburg with a magazine and a pot of soup on the step and a loneliness that had not been named yet. She thought about a train platform and the word "that" and the return ticket in her pocket. She thought about a back room and a lamp and the slow accumulation of something that had no single moment of beginning and no single moment of becoming. It had just grown, the way things grow when the conditions are right, without an announcement, without ceremony, without anyone deciding to force it. "I'm not easy to live with," she said. "I know that," he said. "I keep records of everything, and I work late, and I have opinions about how things should be done." "I've noticed," he said. "You have a difficult horse." "Still working on that," he said. She looked at the piece of wood in her hands, the carved measurement, a man who had built space for her before he knew her name. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "Yes." "Yes," she said again, more plainly, because he looked like a man who needed to hear it twice. He let out a breath. She had not seen him do that before. Actually exhale with the full weight of something released. And it changed his face in a way she was glad to have seen, the private face under the composed one, the face of a man who had hoped for something and had not been sure he would get it. He reached across the work table and put his hand over hers, over the piece of wood with its carved measurement, and she turned her hand and held his, and they sat like that in her lamplit workroom with the evening outside the window and the smell of wax and leather and new thread that was, by now, the smell of her life. It was not perfect. She knew that. The house was not finished, and her business had months of hard work ahead of it, and there would be disagreements between two people this particular about how things ought to be done, and the winter would come again, and life in this country was not a thing that got easier, so much as a thing you got more capable of managing. She was not young, and neither was he, and they had both already learned the shape of loss well enough to know that building something does not protect it from all the ways things break. But they would build it anyway. That was the decision. That was always the decision. They were married in September, before the first frost, in a small ceremony in Mrs. Aldrich's back garden, because Mrs. Aldrich had insisted on hosting, and Rebecca had not had the heart to argue with the only person in Timberline who had made her feel welcome the very first evening. It was not a large gathering. Agnes was there, and Pearl, and Clara and her husband, and Hardin, who came without much ceremony and left a bottle of good whiskey on the porch. Henderson brought 3 other Callaway hands who stood in a row and looked awkward in their cleaned-up clothes and ate everything on the table. James Callaway came down from Faro and shook Rebecca's hand at the end with the look of a man confirming that something he'd helped with had turned out correctly. The ceremony itself was simple. They said what they meant and signed what needed signing, and that was that. Wyatt kissed her once, briefly, and she thought it was probably the least dramatic kiss in the history of matrimony, and also somehow exactly right. Mrs. Aldrich cried, which she denied afterward. What? The South House was finished by October, The floors down and the walls chinked and the kitchen stove installed in the right corner, the one Rebecca had identified in June as the only place that made practical sense. She moved her things in on a Saturday with help from Henderson, who moved boxes without complaint and didn't make any speeches about it, which she respected. She kept her workroom at Mrs. Aldrich's for another 3 months, paying rent on it while she built up enough custom to justify the expense of a proper shop on the main street. She got the shop in January, a small building 2 doors from the post office that had been a cobbler's before the cobbler retired to Faro. She painted the sign herself. R. Calloway, repairs, alterations, leatherwork. She had considered for a day whether to keep Harlow professionally, but Calloway was who she was now, and she saw no reason to be complicated about it. The business did not become easy. Business never became easy. It became familiar, which was different. She had full weeks and slow weeks, and the occasional week where 3 things went wrong at once, and she had to sit with her notebook and recalculate. She raised her prices again in the spring, slightly, and the right people stayed and a few of the wrong ones left, and that was fine. Wyatt's cattle operation had a good year. The Eastern Range, protected by the council vote and still operating under the rotational agreement, held through a dry summer better than anyone had predicted. Delaney came by in the fall to look at it, and he stood at the fence with Wyatt and Rebecca on either side of him, and looked at the grass and nodded in the way of a man who has seen what happens when land is managed with patience. "Holds," he said. "Holds," Wyatt agreed. Rebecca looked at this grass and thought about the word liquidation, which she'd said in a courtroom, and about how the opposite of liquidation was something closer to this, something intact, something that had been left enough room to keep going. Patterson, the dog, had moved from the ranch house to the south house without incident or negotiation. He slept on the porch. He had opinions about strangers, exactly as described, and had taken 2 weeks to form his opinion about Rebecca, which had turned out to be favorable, which she regarded as a reasonable outcome of a fair process. She thought sometimes, in the evenings, about the version of herself who had almost gotten back on the train. She thought about her standing on the platform with the ticket in her pocket and the whole town watching, and the particular weight of that moment. The sheer accumulated force of it, the humiliation and the uncertainty, and the very reasonable conclusion that leaving was the sensible thing. She had felt all of it. She had nearly acted on it. What stopped her was not courage, she had decided. Courage was too clean a word for it. What stopped her was something more ordinary and more stubborn, the refusal to let someone else's bad behavior determine the geography of her life. The refusal to be removed by a man who had not earned the right to remove her. The specific anger, clean and certain, of a woman who has done nothing wrong and is being asked to disappear for someone else's convenience. That was not courage. That was just not being willing to lie about what was fair. The frontier, she had come to understand, was not a romantic thing. It was not the thing described in the novels she had read in Harrisburg, with their large gestures and their easy heroes. It was hard and particular, and it did not care about your feelings, and the people who survived in it were not the ones who were strongest or loudest or most forceful. They were the ones who kept showing up, who kept doing the work, who did not mistake motion for progress or noise for power. She had shown up. She had kept showing up. That was the whole of it. Wyatt came in from the south pasture in the last of the evening light, the way he came in every evening, dust on his coat and the dog at his heels, and that particular quality he had of occupying whatever space he was in without announcing it. He washed his hands at the basin. He sat at the kitchen table. He looked at her working at the counter with the expression she had come to know as his version of contentment. Not demonstrative, not performed, just present, just real. "Good day?" he said. "Good enough," she said. "You?" "Henderson's horse finally settled," he said. "Took him a year." "Persistence," she said. "Stubbornness," he said. "Same thing, applied differently," she said. He almost smiled. She had gotten better at catching it. She put the food on the table and they sat across from each other in the kitchen of a house built with extra tall doorways in a town she had nearly left. And the evening came down around them, and the mountains went dark in the distance, and the dog settled on the porch, with a sound of deep and absolute satisfaction. And the two of them ate their supper and talked about the things people talk about when they are building a life together. Not grand things, not the kind that make good speeches, just the ordinary specific things that are, in the end, what a life is actually made of. Outside, the western sky held its light longer than it had any right to, the way it does in that country, as if it knows that what's underneath it is worth illuminating a little longer before the dark comes in. It always came in eventually. That was the nature of things. And they were always still there in the morning,